Hello everyone. Greetings from the 7th of Nero. AJ here with the third piece on the economies of the nations of Immoren, the titular Iron Kingdoms in particular. Like the remainder of the videos which cover this sort of niche topic, there is not much by way of source material concerning stuff like the minutiae of trade, or, as will be touched upon here, the natural resources of a given region. There is little which the writers could include that might be impactful, or even relevant at times, to an IKRPG campaign. And since the following spiel refers to even more workmanlike subjects than coins or even the trade dynamic among nations, it is very much an indulgence as far as content goes. It exemplifies the most peripheral of peripheral supplementary material for RPG world building. Perhaps because of this, beyond the simplest information concerning what natural resource can be found where, there is a fair amount of necessary supposition to make the most of the topic. Thus, it is somewhat difficult to say whether much of what follows is canonical or not. But it is at least very possible. Even probable. Let it never be said the land does not provide amply for all of its inhabitants. While I cannot speak to the nature of the continent of Zu except in second-hand accounts, or to the Orgoth homelands, or to whatever other lands beyond Cain which remain alien to Immorese's eyes, I am well travelled enough across this continent to know it is as generous as it may be, even if perils may be found at any corner. And this is despite what our land's denizens have subjected it to. We know, or at least the wisest of philosophers believe, that the dragons are not of Cain, or else their blight would have a more notably symbiotic relationship with the land which might yield some benefit to it over the past several millennia. And I am a child of those who devastated much of central Immoren. Countless wars across the continent, fought by every nation and every race, have torn the landscape apart, and the dead have leached from the land by necromancy just as much as become a part of it. Yet Cain and Immoren continue to provide. There is fertile soil to be found across more than just the populated regions, metals of every quality for every purpose, minerals of every type and every value, and there is rarely a lean catch for fishermen whether they ply their trade along river or coast. But as is to be expected, one is more likely to find certain resources in certain locations. As the nation with the longest stretch of coastline which looks out into open ocean, while also being the furthest north, more of Khador's natural produce comes from the sea than most other nations, second only to Ord, whether relatively speaking or in absolute terms. This being the case due to the size of Khador, whether its area or its population. Notably, almost every widely known whaling venture in the Iron Kingdoms and Immoren is Khadoran. In addition to this is a wealth of mineral resources, with iron for its war production, whether warjacks or warships, or silver to keep a healthy circulation of coinage and prestige products for the noble and bourgeois classes. And unsurprisingly, most of Khador's grain cultivation occurs towards the south, with Umbri, Cardoska and Cordostred being the Volskias with the greatest expanses of arable farmland, something which also aids in any potential war effort as fresh corn and wheat can be stored and shipped with virtually no strain and low cost to military logistics. And though many expansive forests span the full length and breadth of the country, lumber, whether for industrial purposes or for craftsmen, is rarely exported. Due to the unceasing need for fuel for one purpose or another, the charcoal-producing industry is often the largest buyer of lumber in Khador, as well as paper mills and domestic craftsmen, tradesmen and wholesalers. Elsewhere, similarly extensive pastoral farming has meant the Khadoran people have a palate for a great variety of meats, particularly in the north, which presents a contrast with the preponderance of consumer crops grown in the south. And this is not to mention wool, which, along with other numerous fibrous plants, means Khador is also known for textile mills. This leads to a well-established economy with respect to clothing, and red dye, as one might expect. Lastly, but by no means least, is the well-known cultivation of tubers. In particular is the variety which was adapted for production in the colder climes of Middle Khador, such as in Skarovnia, Gorzitska and southern Kos. While still suitable for cooking, this particular variety of potato is most famous, or perhaps infamous, for being the main starting ingredient in the distillation of Yatka, which has a sharper taste than produced by potatoes from more temperate fields. That said, such a distinction is an almost purely Khadoran opinion, and not just because I cannot discern any difference between one Vyatka and another when it comes to taste. Counter to the raw quantity of resources the Khadorans can call upon is the diversity and quality of what is available to Cygnar. In general, Khador's southern rival is like the other original Iron Kingdoms, insomuch everything the country needs for almost every purpose it can produce. Of note, though, is the sheer variety of fresh produce which is grown along the market line, the main train line which links the major cities of Caspia and Farin with Point, Bourne and Baines Market, a route which crosses much of the floodplain in the southern reaches of the Black River. This placement along the busiest rail line in Immoren also means the actual quality of produce depreciates least when fruit and vegetables are moved from farm and field to market and store, and that extends to much of the rest of the country thanks to the rail line which connects Caspia with Orvin in West Shore. Metals and minerals are plentiful thanks to extensive ore seams underneath the Wormwall Mountains, and thanks to the diverse terrain which makes up the provinces of Cygnar, one can find soil and plains suitable for aforementioned fresh produce, textile fibre plants, grazing, livestock feed, and more or less any requirement for a complex agricultural industry. Likewise, lumber mills, precious and non-precious gem mines, and construction quarries can be found quite easily with minimal effort or knowledge, such is the depth of resources available in this country. Additionally, Cygnar can boast one particular well-established industry which outstrips that in every other country in Immoren. So much so, production in Cygnar alone is greater than that of the remainder of the continent put together, and that is of alchemical ingredients and, by association, products. The alchemical factories outside Farin and Clocker's Cove form the backbone of Western Immoren's chemical industry, and while other major facilities can be found elsewhere throughout the Iron Kingdoms, most notably the factory overseen from the former Llaelese headquarters for the Order of the Golden Crucible, the Thunderhead in Merowyn, and the sites which flank Cherov on Dron in Khador, their output cannot match that of their counterparts in Cygnar. Thus, the merchants of that nation should count themselves fortunate to be able to call upon such bounty with which they can make many a gold coin. On the other hand, Ord is not so fortunate as her neighbours to north and south. Like Khador, the Ords rely greatly on the bounty of the ocean, but unlike their northern rival, what supplements this from the land is much less diverse and sparser in general. The land is divided between rugged hills and swampy lowlands, with little in between, making arable farmlands come at somewhat of a premium. Thus, it is little surprise that a larger proportion of Ord's resources comes from piracy. Perversely, income from piracy is treated by many pirates themselves as the equivalent of taxable, though the lack of standardized rate which is conferred to the crown is perhaps understandable. But despite this, and though most of the goods upon which daily life relies is imported and traded from without, the lands where the people of Ord live are not without bounty. A little of everything a country might need to support a developed industrialized economy can be found throughout the country. For example, the woodlands of Hitha is the source of workable timber, and the plains of Cossetio are sufficient for pastoral farming even if the animals bred are not of the finest stock, while some small degree of large-scale textile production can be found in Alma and Tordoro. Thus, everything the Ords need, they can provide for themselves to at least some extent, making it easy to identify what needs to be imported, luxuries and otherwise. As to Llael, it is little surprise Khador wished to incorporate Llaelese Umbria into their empire. While there has long been a case for arguing historic and demographic precedent in wishing to unify Umbria, even if Khador and imperial ambitions meant it would always be as of a Losk rather than as an independent or even just an autonomous territory, the eastern half of Umbria is a region rich in resources. Being paired with one of the southernmost provinces of Khador, Umbria, and all of Llael at that, is quite temperate, with plenty of fertile areas within the floodplains of the upper Black River. Indeed, much of Khador's eastern neighbours' crops are harvested from fields in Llaelese Umbria and the adjacent duchies. Meanwhile, the mountainous regions to the north are dotted with mines which yield moderate quantities of precious gems and metals for the more artisanal products the craftsmen of Rainier and Merowyn are known for, as well as alchemical tools and instrumentation. Also, while the textiles sector of Llael's economy is not as substantial or as industrialized as in other countries, in particular Khador, it is nevertheless very influential. The finery of the duchy's noble classes and that which is exported is well known for setting fashion trends across the Iron Kingdoms. This is in stark contrast to Rhul, which, like Khador, is frigid, but without the benefit of geographic diversity which might provide it with ample arable land. Predictably, their most notable resource is metal, in all forms and rarities, with small sidelines in precious gems and alchemical ingredients, all of which lean into the dwarven stereotype of master craftsmen, known for exacting standards and intricate handiwork. Nevertheless, extensive seams of iron and other industrial metals can be found in every Rhulic county, and each is supposedly known for a nuanced way of working their steel, thanks to the geological differences which gives rise to varying compositions in the mined ore. Like most, though, I can only discern the difference between patterned steel which is crafted for export and that which is crafted for local use. Due to the lack of grazing plains and forestry, even in ancient times, Rhul imports a fair bit more proportionately than most other states in Immoren. And grain must also be imported in some measure to supplement the modest amounts of crops grown in fields scattered around the fringes of the Almsdeep and in the southern lowlands of Hanagor and Urgosh Shiel. The Protectorate of Menoth, or at least as it once was, had similar problems to Rhul, insomuch its arid lands had comparatively little to offer those who lived upon it. almost all which the Sulmenites could use for themselves was concentrated around Sul and Immere, while little could be sourced in the south except the occasional mineral or gem mine, none of which were as wealthy as rivals elsewhere throughout the Iron Kingdoms. Consequently, and in lieu of wanting to rely upon excessive imports to make up the shortfall in many different resources, the Sulmenites adopted many of the pastoral traditions of the indigenous Idrians. Before doing so, though, imported goods from Khador and Cygnar, the latter of which was part of the treaties which resulted in the formation of the Protectorate, made up most of that country's domestic consumption. And such is the poor quality of soil tilled in the Protectorate, even the floodplains of the Sithne and Harbour rivers are not especially suitable for the large-scale cultivation of crops to the extent the land there is used only for subsistence farming by the local people, with only a little traded in ancient Ichthia. Nowadays, as one might expect, all resources are obtained purely as a result of opportunity with the collapse of the Synod. What little there was to be had before may as well not exist today. A strange reverse of the Protectorate's circumstances is the nightmare empire of Cryx. Prior to their diplomatic overtures of late which led to limited trade with mainland Immoren, the Cryxians were not known for a wealth of natural resources beyond what could be surmised from trends in their population and war efforts. Not much is known about what can be found or done where throughout the archipelago, so we can but estimate. What is known is that iron and other industrial metals are extensively mined to supply the necessary hardware for the Cryxian war machine, helljacks and bonejacks being the most obvious product, along with the various weapons and parts for the undead legions. Beyond that, crops and livestock do exist across the Shard Islands to feed the living denizens of Torok's realm, even if one suspects Torok's blight makes it difficult to do so the closer one gets to his residence at the Dragon's Roost, or Skell when he deigns to govern more directly. And the same applies to the necessary raw materials required for shipbuilding, civil engineering, and textiles, since these are all observable products. Everything else is obtained, as a maritime nation, from the seas, whether it be from fishing or offshore farming, or piracy. However, unlike Ord, I understand Cryxian pirates do not consider their ill-gotten gains as broadly taxable, at least when no one is around to force them to share. Lastly, and moving from one realm of the partially dead to another, Ios is in a position of some uncertainty, and it is difficult to say what will be made of its untapped resources. I say untapped because of how much that land has changed since its founding. Time was, flourishing industry was to be found in every Ithil. But the great malaise, the exodus of the Nis, the harrowing of Isira, and others besides, rendered much of Ios plentiful, but largely uninhabited. The mines which ran the length of the Iosan peaks were abandoned and fell into disrepair, except those few which were kept running in Lurinthil. To the 5 empty Ithils, little of real use was left except the sprawling fields and plains, easy to take advantage of, and easier still to maintain for the dwindling population. Indeed, most internal traffic among the remaining cities of Shir, Linchinal, and Iris were traders who transported timber more than anything else, to be sold for construction or carpentry in Llael and Rhul, as well as within Ios itself. But even this gradually died away as trade deals with neighbours were cancelled and, when the Great War of the Houses took place, our country closed its borders entirely, even to the dwarves, with whom elves had been at least cordial ever since first contact was made between our two peoples. Before the Infernal Invasion, there was little industry and large-scale agriculture across the country, with nearly all of it concentrated in the 3 most populous Ithils. Even through this concentration, none of it, whether grain, mining, mills, livestock, alchemical materials, or any other basic processing, was to the degree or output of any of the other nations of Western Immoren. The quality, however, was, and always had been, among the best, even if there was rarely any way for that quality to translate into cash value, outside of smuggling and black market dealing with collectors outside of Ios's borders. Thus, it will be curious to see just what the new Masters of Shir, rumoured to be the preeminent eldritch noble House Callis, will do to accept what their part of Cain can offer them.